For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me to discuss Suttner's view, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Morning. Morning.
Do you think there is any value in celebrating our Freedom Day, or is it just another meaningless ritual?
You know, people get very cynical about celebrations, and especially when there have been so many damaging revelations about state operations, government operations, and things like that. But I believe we need to try to get a balanced view and to remember that when we celebrate Freedom Day, we are celebrating in the first place freedom from apartheid. And 27th of April is the day of the first democratic elections. And the demand for universal adult suffrage, one person, one vote, was a very, very important demand for liberation in South Africa. And when it was gained, it had a lot of meaning in South Africa. The notion of universal was exactly the opposite from whites only. The notion of adult is also important because under apartheid, and still today in some people's discourse, black people, and Africans in particular, are called boys and girls. They are infantilized. So the notion of adulthood was also very important. You'll see this in the early language of African nationalism. It's a masculinized language where they talk about recovering our manhood, our virility. In other words, they see freedom in terms of acquiring recognition as an adult human being and not just a boy or a girl. Now, there have been problems we have to acknowledge, but there have also been big advances in this period of 20 years. I think that we need to be careful when we focus on the corruption and the problems of the present, to recognize that there are some things that people experience today that were unimaginable before 1994. I mean, when you wanted to contact someone who lived in some rural areas, they would have to travel to the nearest white town to use a public phone in order to phone you. The electric wires would be going. Black people in many rural areas, their only knowledge of telephone wires and electricity was when they saw wires going from one white town to the next. And now, in most of these areas, access to people through telephone is much easier, mainly cell phones, although you do get ordinary phones there as well. Many people got water for the first time, although it's not always been sustainable. They've not maintained it properly, and some places have never got water to this day. Same with electricity. We know there are problems. But I think it's important that we understand that more could have been achieved. However, we must not devalue the importance of liberation. In my own case, I used to sometimes say, because of my experience in the United Democratic Front in the 1980s, that there needs to be more space for popular democracy. And I didn't place enough weight on representative democracy, on having the vote, but I think that that in itself is a very important gain.
In other words, do you think that the elected representative government has worked well?
Well, you know, I think we have to look at it critically. Now, what I mean by critically is not criticize, but evaluate. And when I said now that I used to focus on having something more than a representative government, I used to say we need more participatory democracy, that is, ability of people to influence through representations, but also we needed to encourage grassroots level democratic activities, civics, and all of this. And I didn't really focus sufficiently on what we mean by being represented by some people or person. And the Nkandla affair has really focused attention on what it means to be a representative, what duties people have in relation to those they represent directly, their own political party, but also their duties to South Africans at large. Now, on the one hand, when you vote for someone, representation means that in a sense you are there in place of the person who's voted for you. So that if they voted for you for one or other reason, you actually have an obligation, morally at least, to do what you can to realize what you undertook to the electorate. So that would be the first thing. And I think one of the problems with the present is that link, that connection between the people who elected MPs and the MPs themselves. That connection has been ruptured because what they do is very often contrary to what their constituency elected them for. But there's also a legal obligation, because when you are elected, especially if you're a member of the executive, you have duties not just to the ANC. Social grants, for example, some ANC MECs and MPs think it's the ANC is giving it, but it's a state obligation to all who qualify. And what has become more clear since the Constitutional Court judgment, but even before that, when people criticized what MPs did, is that they are not aware that being the majority in Parliament does not entitle you to do anything you like, that you actually have to act in conformity with the Constitution that obliges you to hold the executive to account, the Constitution that obliges you to safeguard public monies and not allow those public monies to be diverted. Now, when the money for Nkandla was diverted from monies meant for the poor, that was another example not only of an unconstitutional act, but also of a rupturing of a connection with the poor, who were the constituency of most of those MPs. So, in general, I think representation has not worked adequately, but I think we need to be debating what it means and revisiting our understanding, as I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Crema Media's Polity about Freedom Day and the quality of our freedom.